On the 23rd of March, 1942, Adolf Hitler stood before his military architects with a vision that would consume millions of tons of concrete and the labor of countless workers. The Führer's hands swept across the maps of Europe's coastline, from Norway to the Spanish border, as he declared his intention to build what he called the impenetrable wall that would shield Festung Europa, Fortress Europe, from any Allied invasion attempt. The Atlantic Wall, as it would become known, represented more than mere military strategy. It embodied Hitler's obsession with defensive grandeur and his belief that static fortifications could decide the fate of nations. The concept emerged from Germany's strategic reality in the early war years. After the spectacular failures of Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, and the increasingly desperate situation on the Eastern Front, Hitler recognized that Germany would eventually face an Allied assault from the West. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, appointed Commander-in-Chief West, received orders to transform the European coastline into an unassailable barrier. The fortification would stretch over 3,000 miles, incorporating bunkers, gun emplacements, tank obstacles, minefields, and beach defenses designed to annihilate any invasion force before it could establish a foothold on continental soil. Hitler's directive called for 15,000 permanent fortifications, supported by obstacles that would turn beaches into killing zones. The vision drew inspiration from the Maginot Line, France's own defensive masterpiece that the Germans had simply bypassed in 1940. Yet Hitler convinced himself that an island fortress, Britain, could not employ the same flanking maneuvers. The sea itself would force the Allies to attack directly into Germany's prepared defenses. Or so the reasoning went. The construction effort began with fervent energy. Organization Todt, the Reich's military engineering group named after its founder Fritz Todt, mobilized across occupied territories. German engineers, along with forced laborers from conquered nations, began pouring concrete and embedding steel along the coast. The scale proved staggering. Each major defensive position required thousands of cubic meters of reinforced concrete. Gun casemates housing artillery pieces, ranging from 75mm anti-tank guns to massive 170mm naval cannons, began dotting cliffsides and beach approaches. According to documentation preserved in the German Federal Archives and referenced in numerous historical analyses, including those published in the Journal of Military History, the Atlantic Wall consumed approximately 17 million cubic meters of concrete and 1.2 million tons of steel by 1944. These resources represented materials desperately needed elsewhere in Germany's war economy, yet Hitler remained fixated on his coastal fortress. The early construction focused on ports which Hitler correctly identified as essential for any sustained Allied offensive. Fortresses at Cherbourg, Le Havre, and other harbor cities received priority attention. Massive concrete U-boat pens were built at Brest, Saint-Nazaire, and La Rochelle, their roofs over 3 meters thick to withstand Allied bombing. These installations represented engineering marvels, capable of protecting submarines and supplies from even the heaviest aerial assault. By late 1942, the Atlantic Wall existed primarily on paper and in propaganda. Impressive fortifications clustered around strategic points, but vast stretches of coastline remained virtually undefended. The manpower requirements alone exceeded Germany's capacity. Defending 3,000 miles of coast required divisions that were fighting and dying in Russia. The fundamental tension between Hitler's grandiose vision and Germany's overstretched military reality had already begun to undermine the project before construction truly accelerated. On the 15th of November 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel arrived in France with orders to inspect the Atlantic Wall defenses and report directly to Hitler. The legendary Desert Fox, recently withdrawn from North Africa following the Axis defeat in Tunisia, brought fresh eyes to the coastal fortifications. What he discovered horrified him. The much-vaunted wall existed as a fiction more substantial in propaganda newsreels than in military reality. Rommel traveled systematically along the coast, examining bunkers, testing communication systems, and interrogating local commanders about their readiness. His assessment proved devastating. The fortifications concentrated heavily around major ports, exactly where common sense suggested the Allies would avoid landing. Between these strong points stretched miles of beaches defended by little more than barbed wire, scattered mines, and undermanned observation posts. Many bunkers lacked adequate ammunition stores. Communication trenches that should have connected defensive positions existed only on planning documents. The Atlantic Wall resembled a fortress with thick gates but paper-thin walls between them. The field marshal brought to France his hard-won understanding of Allied capabilities, particularly their air superiority and naval firepower. Unlike many German commanders who still thought in terms of the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 to 1941, Rommel had experienced the crushing weight of Allied material superiority. He knew that once enemy forces established a beachhead, the mobility-based tactics that had won Germany its early victories would prove impossible under constant aerial bombardment. Rommel's philosophy for coastal defense diverged sharply from the prevailing German doctrine. His superior, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, advocated for a defense-in-depth strategy. Allow the Allies to land, then destroy them with armored counterattacks launched from reserves positioned inland. This approach had worked in earlier campaigns when the Luftwaffe controlled the skies, and German tanks outclassed their opponents. Rommel argued forcefully that those conditions no longer existed. The invasion, he insisted, must be defeated on the beaches within the first 24 hours, or it would not be defeated at all. With Hitler's authorization, Rommel transformed from inspector to architect of a radically enhanced Atlantic Wall. He demanded millions of additional obstacles. His orders resulted in what German soldiers grimly called Rommel's asparagus, wooden stakes planted in fields behind beaches to prevent glider landings. He multiplied beach obstacles exponentially, demanding that 5 million mines be laid along the coast. Underwater obstacles, designed to rip the hulls from landing craft at high tide, sprouted across tidal zones. Steel hedgehogs, welded rails arranged to pierce boat bottoms, and concrete tetrahedrons created obstacles courses on the sand itself. The field marshal's energy proved infectious. Construction accelerated dramatically under his leadership. Between November 1943 and June 1944, the number of beach obstacles increased tenfold. Concrete consumption reached unprecedented levels. Rommel personally visited construction sites, pushing commanders to work faster, think more creatively about defense, and abandon the complacency that had infected many units stationed in France. These divisions had grown soft on occupation duty, enjoying French wine and countryside while their comrades died in Russia. Yet even Rommel's formidable will crashed against insurmountable obstacles. Labor shortages plagued every project. The demands of the Eastern Front consumed Germany's manpower. Foreign forced laborers, drafted from occupied territories, worked slowly when German overseers weren't watching, engaging in subtle sabotage that delayed projects and weakened structures. Materials arrived late or not at all, diverted to other theaters. The Luftwaffe could spare few aircraft for coastal reconnaissance. Most critically, Rommel never received the armored reserves he deemed essential for his defensive concept. The fundamental disagreement with von Rundstedt over strategy never resolved. Rommel wanted panzer divisions positioned near the coast for immediate counterattack against any landing. Von Rundstedt, supported by many professional officers, insisted on holding armor in Central Reserve for a decisive battle once Allied intentions became clear. Hitler, characteristically, chose the worst possible compromise. He placed some panzer divisions under Rommel's command, others under von Rundstedt, and reserved several elite divisions under his personal control, requiring his explicit authorization before they could be committed to battle. This divided command structure guaranteed that German armor would arrive piecemeal and too late to execute either strategy effectively. By the spring of 1944, approximately 300,000 German troops manned the Atlantic Wall defenses, but the quality of these forces revealed the Wehrmacht's declining fortunes. The elite divisions that had conquered France 4 years earlier were dead in Russia, or committed to fighting the Red Army's relentless westward advance. What remained in France represented a military grab bag that would have been unthinkable in Germany's earlier war years. Whole divisions consisted of older men, soldiers recovering from wounds suffered on other fronts, and troops deemed unfit for the brutal combat in the East. The 716th Infantry Division, positioned in Normandy, averaged 36 years of age, ancient by military standards where 19-year-olds typically formed the backbone of infantry units. Many soldiers suffered from digestive ailments, hearing loss from artillery bombardment, or partially healed wounds that limited their mobility. German commanders sardonically referred to certain units as stomach battalions or ear battalions, grouped by medical condition. Even more problematic, the Atlantic Wall defenders included numerous Ost battalions composed of Soviet prisoners of war who had volunteered for German service to escape starvation in POW camps. These Osttruppen included Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, and soldiers from various Soviet republics, many of whom spoke no German and harbored no loyalty to the Third Reich. Their motivation to die defending Hitler's empire ranged from minimal to non-existent. German commanders understood that these troops might fight adequately in static defensive positions under close supervision, but would likely abandon their posts or surrender at the first opportunity during intense combat. The 709th Infantry Division, stationed along the crucial Normandy coastline, exemplified these problems. The division incorporated approximately 2,000 Osttruppen, primarily ethnic Georgians and Armenians. While some of these men fought bravely during the invasion, others surrendered en masse or deserted their positions at critical moments. German officers couldn't trust these units with sophisticated equipment or crucial defensive sectors, yet they had no choice but to employ them due to desperate manpower shortages. Morale among German defenders varied wildly, depending on unit composition and leadership. Some believed the propaganda that depicted the Atlantic Wall as impregnable. Officers showed troops newsreels of impressive fortifications and assured them that the massive concrete bunkers could withstand any bombardment. Hitler's speeches, broadcast to the troops, promised that any invasion attempt would end in a catastrophic bloodbath surpassing the Gallipoli disaster of the First World War. Some soldiers genuinely believed that their defensive preparations would prove decisive. Others harbored deep skepticism. Veterans rotated from the Eastern Front recognized the signs of impending defeat that higher command refused to acknowledge. They had experienced the overwhelming material superiority of their enemies. They knew that the Luftwaffe existed largely as a memory, that the Kriegsmarine could no longer seriously contest Allied naval supremacy, and that Germany was losing the war. For these men, the Atlantic Wall represented not a fortress of victory, but a concrete tomb where they would make their final stand. Daily life for Atlantic Wall defenders mixed tedium with growing anxiety. Soldiers spent their days improving fortifications, drilling for invasion scenarios that seemed abstract until they suddenly became terrifyingly real, and scanning empty horizons for enemy ships. The better units conducted regular training exercises, practicing communications procedures, and counterattack rehearsals. Officers attempted to maintain combat readiness through inspections and maneuvers. But the monotony of garrison duty, combined with the relative comfort of occupation duty in France compared to the Eastern Front's nightmare, produced a dangerous complacency in many units. The defenders possessed limited intelligence about Allied invasion plans. German reconnaissance aircraft rarely penetrated Allied air defenses over Britain. The vaunted Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, had been thoroughly penetrated by Allied counterintelligence operations. Most intelligence reaching German commanders was actually carefully crafted deception provided by captured German agents who had been turned by British intelligence services. The elaborate Allied deception plan, Operation Fortitude, convinced many German commanders that the main invasion would strike at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, rather than Normandy. Equipment shortages plagued every defensive position. Artillery pieces often lacked sufficient ammunition for sustained combat. Many bunkers housed captured French, Belgian, or Soviet weapons that fired non-standard caliber ammunition, complicating supply efforts. The promised reinforcements and modern equipment never arrived in sufficient quantities. Anti-aircraft batteries could not adequately protect coastal positions from Allied air attack. Transport vehicles were scarce, limiting the mobility essential for rapid reinforcement of threatened sectors. The defenders of the Atlantic Wall would face the invasion with a hodgepodge of equipment, insufficient supplies, and no realistic hope of reinforcement once battle began. The propaganda machinery of the Third Reich projected images of the Atlantic Wall as an impregnable barrier bristling with modern weaponry, manned by elite troops eager to hurl the Allies back into the sea. Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda produced newsreels showcasing massive concrete bunkers, powerful artillery pieces, and confident German soldiers. These films, distributed throughout occupied Europe and neutral countries, aimed to discourage Allied invasion plans while bolstering German morale. The reality behind the propaganda revealed a fundamentally different picture. Even in sectors where construction had proceeded most vigorously, critical weaknesses compromised defensive effectiveness. The standardized bunker designs, while impressive in their concrete mass, suffered from tactical limitations that Allied intelligence had identified and exploited. Many artillery bunkers could fire only seaward, lacking the ability to cover approaches from flanking angles. This meant that once Allied troops moved beyond the beach itself, these expensive fortifications became irrelevant or even traps for their defenders. Infantry positions frequently lacked interlocking fields of fire, the fundamental principle of defensive warfare that ensures every approach falls under observation and fire from multiple positions. Communication systems remained primitive and vulnerable throughout the Atlantic Wall's length. Many defensive sectors relied on telephone lines that could be severed by artillery bombardment, leaving isolated strongpoints unable to coordinate with neighboring positions or call for support. Radio equipment existed in insufficient quantities and often proved unreliable. During the actual invasion, this communications breakdown would prove catastrophic, as German commanders lost contact with forward positions within hours of the initial assault, leaving them blind to the actual situation along the coast. The mine belts that Rommel had prioritized never reached planned density. By June 1944, approximately 5 million mines had been laid along the Atlantic Wall, falling far short of Rommel's demand for 50 million. The mines that were in place suffered from various problems. Some were old models dating from the First World War, their explosive reliability questionable after decades of storage. Saltwater corrosion affected mines in tidal zones. The pressure of rapid deployment meant that mine patterns were often poorly recorded, endangering German troops nearly as much as attacking Allied forces. In several sectors, retreating German forces would later become casualties of their own improperly mapped minefields. Behind the coastal crust, the defense in depth that von Rundstedt had advocated for never materialized adequately. Secondary defensive lines existed in theory, but remained largely unbuilt. The mobile reserves necessary to conduct the large-scale counterattacks envisioned in defensive plans were tied down by conflicting command arrangements and Hitler's personal control over their deployment. Even when reserves did move toward threatened sectors, Allied air superiority made daylight movement suicidal. German divisions found themselves attacked relentlessly from the air, their columns scattered, vehicles destroyed, and bridges knocked out, transforming what should have been a few hours' march into a multi-day ordeal under constant bombardment. Intelligence failures compounded physical deficiencies. The German High Command remained convinced until late May 1944 that the main invasion thrust would come at Pas-de-Calais. This conviction, carefully nurtured by Allied deception operations, meant that the strongest fortifications and best troops concentrated in the wrong sector. The 15th Army, stationed at Pas-de-Calais, included more and better divisions than the 7th Army defending Normandy. Some of the most formidable Atlantic Wall fortifications, equipped with long-range artillery capable of shelling England across the Channel, sat useless while the invasion unfolded miles away. The weather added another layer of complexity to German defensive calculations. Rommel believed that the Allies would require several days of good weather for an invasion, calm seas for the Channel crossing, clear skies for air support, and favorable tides. When storms battered the Channel in early June 1944, Rommel left his headquarters for Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and to petition Hitler personally for more resources. Many German commanders relaxed their vigilance, convinced that the weather had bought them time. This complacency would cost them dearly. Resource allocation decisions made years earlier haunted the Atlantic Wall's effectiveness. The concrete and steel poured into massive U-boat pens might have built thousands of additional fortified positions. The emphasis on permanent fortifications over mobile reserves reflected Hitler's personal obsession with static defense, despite the Wehrmacht's traditional excellence in mobile warfare. Every ton of concrete shipped to France represented resources unavailable for tanks, aircraft, or ammunition that might have been employed more flexibly. The Atlantic Wall embodied the strategic ossification that affected German military thinking as the war turned against them. On the 5th of June, 1944, the Atlantic Wall stood as complete as it would ever be. The fortifications represented 2 years of intensive construction, millions of cubic meters of concrete, and the labor of hundreds of thousands of workers. Yet as darkness fell over the channel, the defensive system remained fundamentally incomplete, inadequately manned, and poorly integrated. The defenders sensed something was coming, but had no idea when or where the blow would fall. Weather conditions that evening appeared to preclude any invasion attempt in the immediate future. Storm systems moved through the Channel region, generating rough seas and low cloud cover that would disrupt both naval operations and air support. German meteorologists, working with inferior weather data due to the loss of weather stations in the Atlantic, predicted continued poor conditions for several days. This forecast contributed to the fatal complacency that afflicted German coastal defenses during the critical hours before the invasion. Field Marshal Rommel's absence from France during the invasion's opening hours would become one of history's consequential coincidences. Having departed for Germany on the 4th of June, he was nearly 500 miles from his headquarters when the Allied assault began. His journey reflected both personal considerations, his wife's birthday, and military necessity. The urgent need to petition Hitler for release of panzer reserves to the coastal commander's control. Rommel believed he had time before invasion weather would permit the Allied attack. He was catastrophically wrong. The defenders who remained on duty that night followed routine procedures that had become numbingly familiar over months of false alarms and uneventful watches. Sentries peered into darkness from bunker observation slits, seeing nothing beyond the usual emptiness of sea and sky. Officers completed paperwork in dimly lit command posts. Many troops slept, exhausted from another day of construction work and training. Some soldiers stationed in Normandy's coastal villages had developed friendships with local French civilians, unaware that many of these civilians belonged to resistance networks that had already supplied detailed intelligence about German defenses to Allied planners. Allied air operations that night provided the first indication that something extraordinary was underway. Beginning after midnight on the 6th of June, Allied bombers appeared in unprecedented numbers over the Channel coast. The drone of aircraft engines built to a continuous roar as wave after wave of bombers targeted coastal fortifications and transportation networks. Soldiers in bunkers felt the earth shudder from repeated bombardments. Communications lines, already fragile, snapped under the pounding. Railroad junctions disappeared under cascading explosions. Bridges spanning the Seine River became priority targets, their destruction designed to prevent German reinforcements from reaching Normandy. The aerial bombardment, while massive in scale, achieved mixed results against the Atlantic Wall's physical fortifications. The thick concrete roofs of major bunkers generally withstood even direct hits from heavy bombs. Some fortifications suffered only superficial damage despite receiving sustained attention from Allied bombers. However, the bombardment succeeded brilliantly in disrupting communications, suppressing anti-aircraft defenses, and creating chaos in German command structures. Officers found themselves unable to communicate with higher headquarters or neighboring units. The flow of information that should have alerted German high command to the invasion's true scale and location trickled through as isolated reports from scattered units rather than the comprehensive picture necessary for effective response. Around 1:30 on the morning of June 6th, reports began reaching German headquarters about paratrooper landings. Allied airborne divisions were dropping behind the Atlantic Wall's coastal defenses, tasked with securing critical bridges, road junctions, and artillery positions before seaborne forces landed. The German response to these airborne assaults revealed the Atlantic Wall's greatest weakness. It faced the wrong direction. The fortifications designed to repel attackers from the sea offered little protection against troops dropping from the sky behind them. The scattered nature of Allied airborne drops, many units landed far from their designated zones due to anti-aircraft fire, navigation errors, and the chaos of night operations initially worked in the Allies' favor. German commanders received reports of paratroopers in dozens of locations across Normandy and the Cotentin Peninsula. Unable to determine the main threat, they dispersed their limited reserves, responding to multiple small-scale engagements rather than concentrating forces to eliminate the airborne bridgeheads. The fragmented defensive response allowed Allied paratroopers, despite their dispersion, to accomplish critical objectives and begin organizing for the seaborne assault that would arrive at dawn. As the pre-dawn hours of June 6th progressed, German coastal observers began detecting the massive Allied naval armada approaching through the darkness. The sheer scale of the fleet exceeded the defenders' worst expectations. Nearly 7,000 vessels, ranging from battleships to landing craft, converged on a 50-mile stretch of Normandy coastline. Radar stations that had survived the bombing campaign tracked this armada's approach and transmitted frantic warnings to headquarters. Yet the report seemed almost unbelievable. Could the Allies really be attacking in such weather? Was this the main invasion, or an elaborate feint to draw German reserves away from the real landing at Pas-de-Calais? The 6th of June 1944 dawned gray and violent along the Normandy coast as Allied naval guns opened fire at 5:50 in the morning, their shells screaming overhead to crash against the Atlantic Wall's fortifications. For the German defenders huddled in bunkers and trenches, the bombardment exceeded anything they had experienced or imagined. Battleships offshore delivered shells weighing as much as a small car, their impact creating craters large enough to swallow houses. Cruisers and destroyers added their fire to the maelstrom. The earth shook continuously as thousands of tons of high explosives hammered defensive positions along 5 designated beach sectors. Omaha Beach, assigned to the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, presented the Atlantic Wall at its most formidable. Here, the German 352nd Infantry Division occupied strong positions on bluffs overlooking the beach. Artillery and machine gun bunkers provided overlapping fields of fire across the entire landing area. Unlike many Atlantic Wall sectors, Omaha's defenses had been manned by a competent infantry division that had trained extensively for coastal defense. The defenders were ready. For several hours, the landing at Omaha Beach teetered on the edge of catastrophic failure. American forces clustered beneath a low seawall, pinned down by fire from positions on the bluffs. Officers and sergeants died leading futile charges against prepared positions. Tanks drowned in rough seas or burned on the beach after striking mines. Combat engineers attempting to clear beach obstacles fell to machine gun fire. German defenders, fighting from positions they knew intimately after months of preparation, exacted a terrible price for every yard of sand. This was the Atlantic Wall functioning as designed, a fortified killing zone turning amphibious assault into a bloodbath. Yet even at Omaha, where the Atlantic Wall performed best, fatal flaws became apparent as the battle progressed. Destroyers risking damage from running aground moved to within hundreds of yards of the beach to provide close-range gunfire support, their accurate shooting suppressing German positions. Small groups of infantry, led by junior officers and sergeants, began finding gaps in the defense and infiltrating up the bluffs. Naval gunfire cut communication trenches and telephone lines, isolating German strongpoints from each other and from higher command. Once American troops reached the bluff tops, many German positions could no longer fire effectively due to their limited traverse, the same design flaw that afflicted Atlantic Wall bunkers throughout the fortification system. The other 4 landing beaches demonstrated the Atlantic Wall's inadequacy even more clearly. At Utah Beach, the westernmost American landing zone, navigation errors actually improved the invasion's prospects by depositing troops in a lightly defended sector. The 409th Coast Artillery Battalion, one of the few African-American combat units to participate in the assault, provided critical fire support. German resistance, while determined in isolated pockets, lacked the coordination and strength to prevent American forces from pushing inland. By midday, Utah Beach had been secured at surprisingly low cost. British and Canadian forces landing at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches encountered varying levels of resistance. At some points, German defenders fought tenaciously until overrun. At others, Osttruppen units surrendered en masse at the first opportunity. sometimes emerging from bunkers waving makeshift white flags before Allied troops had even requested their surrender. The variable quality of German coastal defenders created an inconsistent defense that Allied commanders could exploit. Where resistance proved strongest, naval gunfire and specialized armor, tanks modified to clear obstacles, bridge gaps, and destroy fortifications, provided solutions that German planners had not adequately anticipated. The specialized equipment that British forces employed at their landing sectors proved decisive in overcoming Atlantic Wall defenses. Hobart's Funnies, a collection of modified tanks named after their developer Major General Percy Hobart, included flail tanks for clearing mines, bridge layers, fasciné carriers to fill anti-tank ditches, and crocodile flame-throwing tanks. These engineering vehicles, often regarded as eccentric contraptions by conventional military planners, provided practical solutions to the specific defensive challenges posed by the Atlantic Wall. American commanders, who had declined to employ most of these specialized vehicles at Omaha Beach, paid in blood for equipment they dismissed as unnecessary. By nightfall on June 6th, approximately 156,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy. The Atlantic Wall had been breached along its entire length in the invasion sector. German casualties for the day numbered approximately 4,000 to 9,000, with hundreds more taken prisoner. Allied casualties totaled approximately 10,000, including some 4,000 confirmed dead, a heavy price, but far below the catastrophic losses that might have occurred had the Atlantic Wall functioned as its designers intended. 5 separate beachheads had been established, and while they remained vulnerable to German counterattack, the critical phase of the amphibious assault had succeeded. The 7th of June, 1944, dawned over Normandy, revealing the scale of Germany's disaster. The Atlantic Wall, breached along 50 miles of coastline, could not be restored. Hitler's impregnable fortress had been penetrated in a single day. The question now became whether German armored reserves could drive the invaders back into the sea before they consolidated their beachheads and began landing the massive reinforcements waiting in England. The answer to that question would determine not only the Atlantic Wall's ultimate failure, but would accelerate Germany's defeat. Field Marshal Rommel returned to his headquarters on the evening of June 6th after a frantic motor journey from Germany. The reports awaiting him painted a grim picture. The 7th Army commander, General Friedrich Dollmann, had lost contact with numerous coastal units. The magnitude of the Allied landing exceeded initial estimates. Allied air supremacy prevented daylight movement of reserves. Most critically, the panzer divisions necessary for the decisive counterattack remained scattered and subjected to divided command authority that prevented their concentration for a unified strike against the beachheads. The 21st Panzer Division, stationed near Caen and closest to the invasion beaches, had attempted a counterattack on June 6th, but had been stopped by Allied anti-tank defenses and airstrikes before achieving any significant penetration of the beachhead. This division, the only German armored formation close enough to intervene on the invasion's first day, had been committed piecemeal and defeated in detail, exactly the outcome that proper defensive doctrine sought to avoid. The opportunity for an immediate counterattack when Allied forces remained most vulnerable on the beaches had passed. The elite panzer divisions that might have made a difference faced multiple obstacles reaching the battlefield. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Youth, despite its fanatical motivation and full-strength equipment, required 3 days to move approximately 120 miles from its assembly areas to the Normandy front. What should have been an overnight march became an ordeal of destroyed bridges, cratered roads, and constant aerial attack. Allied fighter bombers, Typhoons, Thunderbolts, Mustangs prowled the roads of northern France, destroying any vehicles that moved during daylight hours. The panzers could advance only at night, crawling forward a few miles before seeking camouflage in woods and villages to hide from the inevitable dawn patrols. The Panzer Lehr Division, considered one of the Wehrmacht's premier armored formations, suffered similar tribulations during its movement to Normandy. Allied air attacks destroyed approximately 5,000 vehicles and approximately 130 tanks before the division even reached the combat zone. Its commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, later recalled watching helplessly as his division was gutted like a fish during its approach march. By the time these elite formations arrived in Normandy, they had been reduced to fractions of their paper strength and were committed to battle piecemeal, shoring up threatened sectors rather than assembling for the concentrated counterattack that defensive doctrine demanded. Hitler's personal intervention and tactical decisions paralyzed German command flexibility during the critical hours after the invasion. The Führer, operating from his distant headquarters in Berchtesgaden, refused to accept that Normandy represented the main Allied effort. He remained convinced that a larger invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais, a delusion carefully nurtured by Allied deception operations. This belief meant that powerful German divisions, including the 15th Army's formations, remained stationed in the Pas-de-Calais region throughout June, waiting to repel an invasion that would never come. Not until late July would Hitler finally authorize the movement of these forces to Normandy, by which time the battle had been decisively lost. The command structure problems that had plagued Atlantic Wall planning proved catastrophic during the battle's execution. Rommel wanted immediate, aggressive counterattacks against the beachheads. Von Rundstedt preferred to withdraw to more defensible positions and conduct a deliberate defense. Hitler rejected both approaches, forbidding any voluntary withdrawal, while simultaneously withholding the resources necessary for effective counterattacks. German commanders found themselves trapped in a strategic paralysis, unable to retreat to better positions, yet lacking the means to attack effectively. Units were ground down in attritional combat that favored the side with material superiority, which meant the Allies. The coordination between different service branches that had characterized Germany's early war successes had completely broken down by June 1944. The Kriegsmarine, decimated in earlier campaigns, could offer no meaningful support to ground forces. German destroyers and E-boats attempting to attack the Allied fleet off Normandy were swiftly sunk or driven off. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of German military power, was conspicuously absent. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties on June 6 alone, establishing air supremacy so complete that German soldiers bitterly joked about how to identify aircraft. If it's camouflaged, it's British. If it's silver, it's American. If it's invisible, it's Luftwaffe. By mid-June, the character of the battle had fundamentally changed from a fight to throw the Allies back into the sea, to a desperate struggle to prevent a complete breakthrough inland. The Atlantic Wall, breached and bypassed, ceased to have strategic relevance. German forces fell back on the hedgerow country of the Norman Bocage, where they conducted a skillful but ultimately futile defense that traded space for time. Each village became a fortress, each hedgerow a defensive line, but the strategic initiative had passed entirely to the Allies. The question was no longer whether Germany could win in Normandy, but how badly they would lose. The Atlantic Wall's failure stemmed from fundamental flaws embedded in its conception, design, and execution. These problems reflected broader pathologies afflicting German military planning by the war's middle years. Hitler's interference in tactical and operational decisions, the Wehrmacht's overstretched resources, inter-service rivalries, and a failure to adapt to changing military realities. Understanding these design flaws illuminates why the fortification system failed, despite the enormous resources invested in its construction. The first critical error was the wall's excessive length. Attempting to fortify over 3,000 miles of coastline exceeded Germany's capacity to build, arm, and garrison such an extensive defensive system. Military history demonstrates repeatedly that linear defenses without adequate reserves or mobility become vulnerable to concentration of force at selected points. The Allies could choose where to attack, concentrating overwhelming force at that location, while German defenders had to be strong everywhere, an impossible requirement. The Atlantic Wall's length transformed from an asset in propaganda to a liability in practice. The fortification design itself embodied outdated concepts poorly adapted to modern warfare's reality. The massive concrete bunkers represented triumph of engineering over tactical practicality. Many artillery positions could fire only seaward, useless once enemy forces moved inland. The lack of reverse slope positions, defensive positions on the landward side of coastal ridges, meant that bunkers became death traps once Allied troops infiltrated past them. The standardized bunker designs, while simplifying construction, also simplified Allied planning since intelligence analysts could predict each bunker's capabilities and vulnerabilities from its external appearance. Mines and obstacles, central to Rommel's defensive concept, revealed the limitations of static defenses against a technically sophisticated enemy. The beach obstacles had been designed primarily for high tide effectiveness, but Allied planners simply invaded at low tide when obstacles stood exposed and could be destroyed by naval gunfire and demolition teams. The mine belts, while numerous, achieved insufficient density to be truly effective. More critically, the German military lacked modern mine technology comparable to Allied developments. Many German mines could be detected and cleared with equipment that Allied engineers deployed in large quantities. The integration of natural terrain with artificial fortifications, a principle understood since ancient times, was applied inconsistently along the Atlantic Wall. At some locations, such as the cliffs of Omaha Beach, German engineers had positioned fortifications to maximize natural advantages. At others, defensive positions were cited for construction convenience rather than tactical advantage. Vast stretches of coastline offered natural defensive features, cliffs, rivers, marshlands, that remained unexploited due to insufficient resources and time. The defensive system resembled a collection of individual strongpoints rather than an integrated defensive zone, where obstacles, observation points, firing positions, and reserves worked together synergistically. Communication and command arrangements suffered from problems that rendered effective coordination impossible during actual combat. The reliance on wire communications that could be severed by bombardment left German commanders blind during critical hours. Radio equipment existed in insufficient quantity and often proved unreliable. The command structure itself, with its divided authorities between Rommel, von Rundstedt, and Hitler's direct control over strategic reserves, guaranteed that responses to the invasion would be slow, confused, and uncoordinated. Modern defensive warfare requires rapid decision-making and flexible response to unexpected situations, precisely what the Atlantic Wall's command structure prevented. Intelligence failures compounded design problems throughout the Atlantic Wall's development and operation. German intelligence services had been thoroughly penetrated by Allied counterintelligence operations, a fact that senior German officers should have recognized but consistently dismissed. The success of Operation Fortitude, the elaborate Allied deception plan, revealed the bankruptcy of German intelligence. Not only did German commanders fail to identify where and when the invasion would occur, they continued believing in a phantom army group supposedly preparing to invade Pas-de-Calais for weeks after the Normandy landings. This intelligence failure meant that resources were misallocated, the strongest fortifications protected the wrong sectors, and reserves remained uncommitted during the decisive battle. The personnel assigned to defend the Atlantic Wall reflected Germany's deteriorating military situation by 1944. Committing elite divisions to the Atlantic Wall would have weakened the Eastern Front, where Germany faced an existential threat from Soviet armies. The compromise, garrisoning the wall with second-line troops, older men, units recovering from wounds, and unreliable foreign volunteers, created a defensive force inadequate for the mission assigned to them. Even the most sophisticated fortifications cannot compensate for inadequate troops. The 352nd Infantry Division at Omaha Beach demonstrated what competent defenders could achieve, but most Atlantic Wall sectors lacked units of comparable quality. Logistical shortcomings undermined the Atlantic Wall's effectiveness independent of its design flaws. Ammunition supplies at many coastal batteries proved inadequate for sustained combat. Artillery pieces often lacked the shell stockpiles necessary to engage multiple targets over several days. The variety of weapons employed, including captured French, Belgian, Polish, and Soviet equipment, created a logistical nightmare since each weapon type required different ammunition calibers. Transportation infrastructure behind the coast remained vulnerable to Allied air attack, and when bridges and rail lines were destroyed in the pre-invasion bombardment, resupply of coastal units became impossible. Perhaps the Atlantic Wall's most fundamental flaw was conceptual. It represented static defense in an age when military success required mobility, flexibility, and initiative. The Wehrmacht had risen to dominance through blitzkrieg tactics emphasizing rapid maneuver, combined arms coordination, and exploiting enemy weaknesses. By 1944, Germany had been forced onto the strategic defensive, but Hitler's obsession with holding every inch of ground and his fixation on fortifications represented a philosophical abandonment of German military strengths. Resources poured into concrete might have produced tanks, aircraft, and the mobile reserves necessary for flexible defense. Instead, the Atlantic Wall immobilized resources and troops in positions that proved vulnerable to precisely the kind of concentrated, methodically planned offensive at which the Allies excelled. By late July 1944, the Battle of Normandy had been decisively won by Allied forces. The breakout from the beachhead at the end of July, Operation Cobra, transformed the stalemate in the hedgerow country into a war of movement that swept across France. German armies that had failed to prevent the initial landing now faced encirclement and destruction at Falaise. Paris would be liberated in late August. The Atlantic Wall, bypassed and irrelevant, stood as a monument to strategic failure and wasted resources. The immediate military consequences of the Atlantic Wall's failure cascaded through Germany's entire strategic position. The opening of a viable second front in Western Europe forced Germany to fight a true two-front war for the first time since 1941. Divisions desperately needed to stem the Soviet advance in the East remained trapped in the West, where they were systematically destroyed or forced into humiliating retreat. The industrial resources of occupied France, Belgium, and Holland, which had sustained Germany's war economy, were lost within months. The V-weapon launch sites in northern France, from which Hitler had hoped to terrorize Britain into surrender, fell to advancing Allied armies before they could deliver their promised strategic impact. The resource expenditure on the Atlantic Wall represented one of the war's great strategic miscalculations. The 17 million cubic meters of concrete and 1.2 million tons of steel that went into the fortifications could have produced, by various estimates, approximately 10,000 to 15,000 additional tanks or tens of thousands of aircraft. Given Germany's desperate need for mobile reserves and air cover by 1944, this misallocation of resources proved catastrophic. Every cubic meter of concrete poured into a bunker was concrete unavailable for protecting German cities from Allied bombing, constructing U-boat pens that might have mattered earlier in the war, or building the synthetic fuel plants essential to Germany's increasingly oil-starved war machine. The human cost of defending the Atlantic Wall added another dimension to its failure. Approximately 300,000 troops tied down in coastal defense consumed resources while remaining strategically useless. After the invasion's success, many of these divisions were destroyed in Normandy or during the subsequent retreat across France. Entire formations surrendered en masse as Allied armies encircled them. The garrison of the Channel Islands, approximately 39,000 troops, remained isolated and irrelevant for the war's remainder, surrendering only after Germany's general capitulation in May 1945. These were soldiers who might have made a difference on other fronts, but who were squandered defending Hitler's obsessive fortress vision. The psychological impact of the Atlantic Wall's rapid collapse reverberated through German military and civilian consciousness. The fortification had been presented as impregnable, a guarantee of Germany's continued control over occupied Europe. When it fell in less than 24 hours, the propaganda edifice that had sustained German morale crumbled with it. Soldiers and civilians alike recognized that if the Atlantic Wall could not hold, no defensive position could prevent Germany's defeat. The invasion's success destroyed the myth of German military invincibility that had survived even the disasters on the Eastern Front. Allied planners learned important lessons from the Atlantic Wall's defeat that would influence military thinking for decades. The successful amphibious assault vindicated the doctrine that mobile, flexible forces supported by naval and air supremacy could overcome even well-prepared static defenses. The specialized armor and engineering equipment developed to breach the Atlantic Wall, DD swimming tanks, flail tanks for mine clearance, bridge layers, and armored bulldozers, became permanent features of amphibious assault doctrine. The integration of naval gunfire with ground operations, refined during the Normandy invasion, provided a model for future amphibious operations from the Pacific Islands to Incheon in Korea. The Atlantic Wall's failure also validated the principle that defensive fortifications cannot substitute for mobile reserves and tactical flexibility. Every major defensive line constructed in the war's latter years, the Gothic Line in Italy, the Siegfried Line on Germany's western border, delayed but never stopped Allied advances. The resources invested in these fortifications might have been better employed in mobile formations capable of conducting the defensive maneuver warfare at which German commanders excelled. Static defenses, the Atlantic Wall demonstrated, provide only temporary obstacles that a determined enemy with material superiority will eventually overcome. The fortification system's remnants became subjects of historical preservation and military archaeology in the post-war decades. The massive concrete bunkers, too expensive to demolish, remain scattered along the European coast from Norway to France. Some have been converted to museums, preserving artifacts of the era and interpreting the Atlantic Wall's history for new generations. Others serve more prosaic functions as storage facilities or simply as enduring curiosities on beaches and clifftops. These physical remnants serve as tangible reminders of military miscalculation and the limitations of static defense in modern warfare. Historical analysis has treated the Atlantic Wall as a case study in strategic failure, illuminating multiple aspects of military decision-making, resource allocation, and the interaction between political and military considerations. Academic studies, including those published in journals such as the Journal of Military History and Military History Quarterly, have examined the Atlantic Wall from various perspectives: engineering achievement, tactical failure, economic burden, and symbol of Nazi Germany's declining strategic position. This scholarship has established that the Atlantic Wall's failure resulted not from any single cause, but from the interaction of multiple factors: inadequate resources, flawed design, poor intelligence, divided command, and fundamentally misconceived strategic assumptions. The fortification's failure provides enduring lessons for military planners, historians, and anyone interested in understanding how modern warfare evolves beyond the concepts that guided earlier eras. As the concrete remnants continue their slow decay along European coastlines, they offer silent testimony to the dangers of rigid thinking in an environment demanding flexibility and adaptation. The fundamental lesson concerns the nature of defensive warfare in the industrial age. Since the American Civil War in the 1860s, military theorists had understood that modern firepower favored the defender over the attacker. The trench warfare of the First World War reinforced this lesson, creating a generation of military planners who viewed prepared defensive positions as nearly invincible. The Maginot Line, constructed by France in the 1930s, represented the apex of this defensive thinking. An elaborate system of fortifications that would, theoretically, make invasion of France impossible. Germany's 1940 bypass of the Maginot Line through Belgium should have taught that static fortifications, however sophisticated, could not substitute for strategic flexibility and mobile reserves. Hitler paradoxically learned the wrong lesson from his own success against the Maginot Line. Rather than concluding that fixed fortifications could be outmaneuvered, he convinced himself that the Maginot Line had failed because it didn't extend far enough. The Atlantic Wall, stretching thousands of miles, would not suffer from similar gaps. This reasoning ignored fundamental military principles about force-to-space ratios and the impossibility of being strong everywhere simultaneously. The Allied strategy against the Atlantic Wall, choosing the point of attack, concentrating overwhelming force at that location, and exploiting the breach before defenders could respond, replicated the German strategy against the Maginot Line. The difference was that by 1944, Germany lacked the resources and operational flexibility that had enabled its earlier success. The command structure problems that plagued the Atlantic Wall's defense illustrate the dangers of divided authority during crisis situations. Military organizations require clear command relationships, particularly during the confusion of combat, when rapid decision-making becomes essential for success. The three-way division of authority between Rommel, von Rundstedt, and Hitler guaranteed that critical decisions would be delayed or made with incomplete information. Modern military doctrine emphasizes unity of command and decentralized execution, allowing subordinate commanders to exercise initiative within their superior's intent. The Atlantic Wall's defense violated these principles, resulting in paralysis during the hours when decisive action might have made a difference. The intelligence failures surrounding the Atlantic Wall demonstrate the vulnerability of planning based on incorrect assumptions. German intelligence, compromised by Allied counterintelligence operations, provided assessments that reinforced what Hitler wanted to believe rather than reflecting reality. The success of Operation Fortitude, convincing German commanders that a phantom army group threatened Pas-de-Calais, ranks among history's most successful deception operations, precisely because it exploited German preconceptions and wishful thinking. Modern intelligence doctrine emphasizes the importance of challenging assumptions, seeking disconfirming evidence, and maintaining analytical objectivity, even when conclusions contradict leadership expectations. The technological dimension of the Atlantic Wall's defeat highlighted the accelerating pace of military innovation during the Second World War. The specialized armor and engineering equipment that Allied forces employed to breach coastal defenses had not existed at the war's beginning. The degree of Allied air supremacy that made daylight movements suicidal for German reserves resulted from industrial and technological developments that transformed air power from supporting arm to decisive weapon. The integration of naval gunfire with ground operations demonstrated how different service branches could coordinate their unique capabilities to create combined effects greater than the sum of individual contributions. These technological and doctrinal innovations rendered the Atlantic Wall's fundamentally static defense obsolete before the fortification was completed. The economic analysis of the Atlantic Wall reveals the opportunity costs of major military projects. Every resource committed to one purpose becomes unavailable for alternative uses. In Germany's case, by 1942 through 1944, when Atlantic Wall construction consumed maximum resources, the Wehrmacht desperately needed tanks to replace losses in Russia, aircraft to contest Allied bombing, and synthetic fuel plants to address critical petroleum shortages. The decision to prioritize coastal fortifications over these mobile assets represented a strategic choice with profound consequences. Economic historians have calculated that the resources invested in the Atlantic Wall could have produced sufficient tanks and aircraft to significantly delay Germany's defeat, even if they could not have prevented ultimate Allied victory. The human dimension of the Atlantic Wall story deserves emphasis beyond tactical and strategic analysis. Hundreds of thousands of workers, many of them forced laborers from occupied countries, built the fortifications under brutal conditions. Thousands died from accidents, disease, malnutrition, and mistreatment. The troops stationed along the wall spent months in tedium punctuated by terror when the invasion finally arrived. For soldiers on both sides, the Atlantic Wall became the setting for intimate experiences of combat that marked survivors for life. The individual stories of courage, fear, suffering, and sacrifice that occurred along the wall's length remind us that military history, ultimately, concerns human experiences and choices rather than abstract strategies and statistics. The post-war development of military doctrine incorporated lessons from the Atlantic Wall's failure. The advent of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles made fixed fortifications even more obsolete than the Atlantic Wall had proven. The Cold War saw construction of various defensive lines: the distant early warning line across Arctic North America, the Bar-Lev line in Israel, the electronic barriers along the Korean demilitarized zone. But military planners increasingly recognized that mobility, flexibility, and rapid response capabilities offered better security than concrete and steel. The Atlantic Wall's failure contributed to a fundamental shift in defensive thinking that continues to influence military planning in the 21st century. Modern military professionals studying the Atlantic Wall examine it as a comprehensive case study in what to avoid. Military academies and staff colleges use the fortification as an example when teaching about resource allocation, the danger of rigid planning, the importance of intelligence, the necessity of unified command, and the requirement for defensive plans to include mobile reserves capable of counterattacking effectively. The Atlantic Wall appears in doctrine manuals and tactical primers as a cautionary tale rather than a model to emulate. Its failure has become more instructive than its construction. The bunkers, now harmless, serve as reminders of the war that reshaped the 20th century and the strategic miscalculations that contributed to Nazi Germany's defeat. Tourists walking beaches where thousands died on June 6, 1944, can see the concrete structures that were supposed to prevent the invasion, and understand, with the clarity that hindsight provides, why even the most impressive fortifications cannot guarantee security when strategic fundamentals are neglected. In the final analysis, the Atlantic Wall failed because it represented 19th century thinking applied to 20th century warfare, static defense in an age demanding mobility, and rigid planning when circumstances required flexibility. Hitler's greatest fortification consumed enormous resources that might have been better employed elsewhere, tied down troops who were needed on other fronts, and provided only the illusion of security. When tested on the 6th of June, 1944, it proved unable to prevent determined attackers supported by naval and air supremacy from breaching it within hours. The Atlantic Wall stands as a monument not to German military prowess, but to the dangers of strategic miscalculation, the limitations of fixed defenses, and the enduring military principle that victory requires not just fortifications, but also the forces, flexibility, and strategic vision to employ them effectively. Its concrete remnants eroding along the European coast serve as permanent reminders that in warfare, as in life, rigid barriers eventually crumble before determined effort guided by superior strategy.